Good morning. This is Chapter 2, The Genes of Gregoria. Dear Cousin Sasha, I am a bit embarrassed by the fluency of your English because I know only a few words in Russian. I am practicing. I hope that when I do get there, I'll be able to order my breakfast. Marge says that when I pronounce it, the way I pronounce it, I may get beer and pretzels for breakfast instead of soft-boiled eggs, coffee, and cake. The lack of a second language is a common failure among many Americans. We are just starting to teach other languages in the elementary schools. Perhaps that is a good starting point for me. My parents both spoke so many languages that my friends always assumed that our friends assumed that the children learned at least one of them. The fact is, none of us did. When your Uncle John first arrived here, he was indeed a big, strapping, eager young man, and the greenhorn recruiters were more than happy to send him to the state of West Virginia to work in the coal mines there. He was not enthusiastic about working under the ground, but he saw it as an opportunity to save money and to learn the language. To his dismay, he found out that very few of the men working in the mines spoke English. They were, upon arrival, placed in ethnic working groups with a boss that spoke their language. My father was inadvertently placed in with the Italians because his name ended with an O. Not being able to explain the problem in English, he simply added 2 F's to the name, making it sound like Romanov, the Russian royal name that most Americans knew. When he received his first pay, he had to sign his name as Truskoff. John and Philip did not enter the country legally, and the only documents that John ever had to present to his next employer were the papers from the mines. Hence, we are the Truskoffs. I can remember that each time one of my parents' friends spoke to me in another language, I would smile and shake my head. Even though I recognized some of the words, my father was adamant about his children speaking only English in the home. He was very critical of his Polish friends who tried to bring Poland to America. So many of them remained dominated by the church and forced their children to live in Polish enclaves, isolated from their new countrymen and the language and culture of their new country. Spanish-speaking people are doing the same thing today, but my father did not believe in it. He wanted us to speak only English, with no accent, and we were to be true Americans. To me, it always seemed to be a strange anomaly. He was so nationalistic. If I caught a fish, he would say, "That's a nice fish." But in the Dnieper-Bug Canal, they pull fish out twice that size, with their hands. In a grocery store, he might say, when looking at a tomato, "Have you heard? In Siberia, scientists are growing bigger tomatoes in greenhouses." He was always showing us items about great Soviet achievements that he had read about in his Russian language publications. At the same time, he did all that he could to make his children homogeneous Americans. Americans who remained proud of their heritage. The dichotomy caused by the love and commitment to his family, the love and commitment to his parents' family, and to the two countries, permeated the very psyche of all his children. In my opinion, it made us better citizens, because none of us became blind faith Americans. Blind faith citizens are beneficial only to the tyrants, not their countries. Both of my parents emphasized the importance of researching both sides of a controversial issue and making your own choices. Unfortunately, for my own children, my choices were very often outside of the mainstream of American political thinking. When you take that road at an early age, you always believe that there will be a coming together. You tell yourself that someday you will be able to sleep peacefully in the middle of the herd when you are welcomed back. But there always seems to be another battle. I publicly opposed our military intervention in Korea. Supporting Syngman Rhee after his own people rejected him was not my idea of an honest or productive foreign policy. The frequent riots that still take place in Seoul are an ever-echoing rejection of Truman's folly, which brought death to so many Americans. Today, Koreans are still fighting for free elections in the South and unification of their country. It must have been very difficult for my young children when I protested the intervention in Vietnam. But today, my daughter Nancy participates in a weekly vigil against the proliferation of nuclear weapons. My daughter Dory does a radio program for university stations that deals with controversial subjects the mass media dare not touch. My children are all grown and out of the house. My oldest daughter Kathy has 2 children of her own and has been involved with horses since her childhood. My son David is the youngest, and he does well drilling. As a young man, I thrived on activism and confrontational tactics, but one does get weary of the battle. When you are young, idealistic, and certain that you are right about everything, the results of your actions reflect only on you. But when you are a little older and the father of 3 girls and a boy, your actions may cut them from the herd also. That is a particular problem for teenagers who want so much to belong. I had much more difficulty than my parents did in convincing my children that my actions were that of a patriot. I never doubted Bessie and John's motivations. I knew how much they loved America and how much they wanted to improve it for their children. You see, Sasha, it was so much easier for me because there were simply fewer shades of gray. I am reminded of a story that John Reed tells in his book, 10 Days That Shook the World. In it, he describes the conversation between an illiterate soldier and an anti-Bolshevik student. They were debating the merits of the revolution, and the soldier says, "There are 2 classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and I know that you must be on one side or the other. For my children, nothing was that simple. We lived in a nice middle-class house among middle-class people. We had plenty of food and the good things in life. My children had access to the best education and an accelerated start in life. When they were young, they just couldn't understand why I wasn't satisfied and why I didn't just write happy books. How do you explain your intellectual molding to your children when you know that all they want to do is be accepted by their peers with no encumbrance?" Sasha, at this writing, I face more surgery, and the future is uncertain. My concern now is that I will get you involved in a project and not be able to handle my share of the work. The answer to your question, however, is still yes. The idea of collaborating with you on a book still excites me very much. The purpose for doing it would be the same as yours. I, too, would get great satisfaction out of putting my life up before me and looking at it, judging it, illuminating the dark days that really shaped my life, and then handing it to my children for their final judgment. As small children in America, we are taught that our Constitution will focus the beacon of isonomy on us, and we shall pursue our goals in that light. Many of us pay, traumatically, a very high price for that kind of teaching. Justice and equality slip around in America like a pickerel under the lily pads, and for too many of us, it's just impossible to catch. More Americans are willing to accept and make the best out of what one of our former presidents once said, "There are many things in life that are unfair." However, he said that in response to a question about the fairness of depriving poor women of the right to an abortion, while women of means could have an abortion. That is not simply unfair. That is unjust. There is a difference. Justice cannot restore the sight of a person born without vision. It is unfair that some of us are born blind. It is unjust not to make every effort to accommodate them. We still have a long way to go in this country before we can accomplish the liberty and justice for all that we have included in our Pledge of Allegiance, a pledge that we ask school children to say every morning. Sasha, I was so moved by your letter. You did indeed tell me things that I did not know, but most of all, you put me back in touch with my parents. When my mother died, I remember thinking about how little I knew of her youth, and I had the same experience when my father died. I used to think that intentionally obliterating the past was only a course of conduct for first-generation Americans who felt a mixture of shame and pride in their greenhorn parents. But then I came to the conclusion that it is just a mean trick of nature. I can remember having some fun with an audience of college students at a lecture. During the question period, one of the students asked me to elaborate on a remark that I had made about the publishing industry in the United States. I mentioned that many of the major publishing houses had been taken over by huge corporations and that they were publishing mountains of very profitable intellectual garbage. I gave as an example the hundreds of sex books that are cluttering the bookstores' shelves, written by so-called physicians. There are books about how to think about sex, about how to talk about it, about what not to think, what to think, how to do it, how not to do it. There are books about the sex lives of teenagers, young adults, old adults, chimpanzees. There are even books about the sex lives of college students who should have their minds on other things. That, of course, drew laughter. But the truth is, Sasha, that American bookstores are crammed full of waste. It is the staple of the advertising business, the television industry, the magazine and publishing industry in general. Excuse me. In China, I said, there are 1 billion Chinese. I doubt if any of them read any of these books. At the same time, I have never heard of a Chinese who claims to have arrived on this earth via an immaculate conception. At the faculty dinner that evening, a young assistant professor came over to the table and said that he wished that I had not told that story about the Chinese because he had a very special evening planned for that night, and now it didn't seem so special. We all laughed, but the truth is that none of us wish to live in stark reality unless we must. We would much rather view the past in pretty technicolor while we munch popcorn. It is the balm of nature that makes young people think that they invented sex and that they created the earth. How insignificant they would all feel if they had to accept the fact that billions created it before them. I believe that when that sunscreen, so to speak, is taken away from our young people, the society shrivels and dies. We must be careful, however, not to try so hard to protect the young from the harmful rays of the sun that we drown them in the sunscreen instead. We Americans tend to do that. We shield our youth from the truth about our terrible wars so that they can fight the next one. In our impetuous compulsion to police and rule the world, we find little use for historical facts. The rudder of history is always the missing element guiding our ship of state, so we tend to circle. I must confess, Sasha, that your letter filled me with emotion, and at times I was moved to tears. Reading about the relationship between your mother and my father answered a lot of questions for me. When asked about why she left Russia, my mother would not tell horror stories about how terrible life was there for Jews. My father would never say one negative thing about his homeland. I often wondered why he left. Now I know. It was not so much hardship, but fear that drove him from his country. He had so much pride. Feeling that he was forced to leave must have haunted him all of his life. You did raise one question that may come on later, that may come too late to solve. My mother, Bessie Kendall, was born just outside of Pinsk. She lived there for the first 14 or 15 years of her life. I wonder if she knew your mother. They were about the same age. My grandmother, Rachel, was very much involved in dangerous escapades in Russia. The stories that my grandfather told us were that she smuggled guns under her long skirts. Where she got the guns and to whom she gave them is a part of the story that remains murky. Rachel was a domineering woman who had the courage of her convictions. She stepped quickly into middle-class America, but was appalled by the conditions that some American workers had to face every day, in particular the conditions that her own children had to endure in the textile industry sweatshops. Her husband, my grandfather, Zadie Kendall, was an expert blacksmith in the old country and had little trouble finding jobs. He worked for the city of New York, and as most of the mass transportation then depended on horse-drawn trolleys, he did very well. He bought a nice home in Brooklyn, and there he raised 5 daughters. My grandmother would go into a rage every time she told us about the crazy rabbis who came to the house to mourn when the 4th and 5th daughters were born. They said prayers for the poor man who had no sons. At the end of the story, she would swear that she threw boiling hot water at them. I have such fond memories of that house and of her little dog, Happy, who she called Eppe. But most of all, I remembered the heated political conversations that took place around the kitchen table almost every night. Rachel set the tone, and her oldest daughter, Bessie, my mother, and her youngest sister, Molly, soon became involved in the radical activities of the industrial workers of the world. My mother was so proud of the fact that the Wobblies, as they were called, pointed the direction for the great labor movement that was to follow. During the First World War, the IWW was infiltrated with provocateurs and those who saw the organization as a communist conspiracy. The American media linked them to the Bolsheviks in Russia. Leaders were arrested and convicted on charges that ranged from sabotage to murder. They were rounded up as subversives and given long prison sentences. This, of course, was a successful program to divide and destroy the IWW. By 1925, the Wobblies were bypassed by another trade union and workers' organizations, but the legends of their songs helped to carry the labor movement into the 30s and the 40s. I heard the story of Joe Hill many times when I was a boy. He was the labor organizer who, when facing a firing squad in a Utah penitentiary, said, "Don't mourn for me, organize." A song was written about him, and I could see the tears in my mother's eyes when Paul Robeson sang, "I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me." As a child, I reveled in the stories my mother and sister told about their union activities. One of my favorites was about the tricks that they used to play on the goons and the police who guarded the walls around the textile mill in New Jersey. The police were there to prevent the union organizers from getting to the workers. Oh, Sasha, I can remember the two of them giggling and drinking tea through a lump of sugar that they held in their teeth. My mother, who was by far the fastest runner, would hide in the bushes on one side of the street. Her sister Molly, carrying a large paper bag, walked toward the wall of the mill. When the police converged on her, she ran as fast as she could, knowing that she would be caught. When the police did catch her, they found that she carried only a bag full of shredded newspaper. Bessie would then take advantage of the police distraction and race from her hiding place to throw her bag of leaflets over the wall. With gestures, they both would act out how Bessie outran the police. "The fat-bellied cop," she would say, and I would fall down laughing. Those were preschool years for me, and it was all a wonderful game. I learned all the songs, and their friends always asked me to sing them. "You will eat by and by in that glorious land above the sky. Work and pray, live on hay. You'll get pie in the sky when you die." Then everyone in the room would shout, "That's a lie!" And I would join in the laughter. As the strikes dragged on, the laughter diminished. One day, goons entered the union headquarters carrying pool sticks and smashed everything, including some heads. I was rushed out the back door, across an empty lot, and put on a bus for home. I had no idea about what happened to my mother until she got home the next day. The police arrested union members in their own union headquarters for disturbing the peace. My mother was sent home to her family in the morning. When the horrible dark cloud descended on America in 1929 and the entire economy shattered on the rocks of Wall Street, I was just a baby, and probably an unwelcome one at that. Like millions of other first-generation Americans, my father watched helplessly as everything that he worked for disappeared. We had to move to another town where surviving was just as difficult, but less embarrassing. So many new Americans were uprooted and looking for less expensive housing that they tended to implode in the cities into tight-knit little communities. At the same time, the New York Times was carrying a daily page of ads from people who were trying to sublease their very expensive penthouse apartments in the wealthier sections of town. Just 2 years earlier, the apartments were occupied by paper millionaires who thought that the boom of the 20s would last forever. They felt certain that they would all move back in soon. They clung to the fantasy of the press that insisted that the Wall Street crash was just a temporary aberration. It would all turn around by the end of the month, they were told. It was a month that lasted 10 years. There is much discussion here today about the poor quality of our school textbooks. That is not a new subject for me. I have always been appalled by the fact that so many of the people who shape present-day America have been excluded. The publishers have also lacked the courage to fully describe the political role of the church. When young people today read about the heartbreaking market crash of 1929 and the suffering that it brought with it, they may read a lot of statistics. What they cannot extract from those bloodless numbers is the devastating psychological damage incurred by those who had to endure the pain of watching helplessly as their children went hungry. Many men never did fully recover from having their dignity and pride crushed. I know that my father, your Uncle John, never did. The enormous blow to his confidence strangled his ambition. He was a man in his 50s when the war came along, and the economy was fully reignited. My mother held us all together during the Depression years. When the oppressive electric company turned off the electricity, as they did to millions of Americans, she got kerosene lamps. When the landlord took the front door off of our apartment for failure to pay the rent, she hung a blanket over it. Sasha, that incident is a typical Depression story. The poor landlord was an immigrant from Poland who arrived about the same time that my parents did. He was a happy man who enjoyed having us children watch him make his famous sausage the way his father did in the old country. With the help of the church, he was able to open a butcher shop that prospered and to get a loan from the bank that enabled him to buy the building that housed his shop. He and my parents were close friends and often spent evenings talking about the old country over a glass of tea. After the crash, few of his tenants had the money to pay their rent, and he could not meet his obligations to the bank. He did what he could to force the tenants to pay, straining the friendships. It was to no avail. The bank foreclosed and took his building and his business. To envision that cherubic, successful community leader years later, after he had lost weight and the sparkle in his eyes, standing in line with the very people that he tried to collect rent from, was very sad. Picturing him and his tenants together, all waiting for the federal handouts of potatoes and flour, tells the story of that era the way that it should be told. The entire nation was turned into one big asylum, and the inmates all seemed to be saying, "Well, we're here, we might as well be crazy." One of my own personal memories is still vivid in my mind. Some companies hired out-of-work men who would do anything to get food for their families. The men were called bounty hunters, and their job was to collect bills that the company had given up on. The bounty hunter was allowed to keep a percentage of the money that he collected for the company. One such obnoxious collector came to our apartment and threatened to turn off the water unless my mother paid him the money. Bessie picked up a coal pail that was near the stove and overturned it on his head. I can still see the rage on the man's blackened face. He left, threatening to call the police, but the police never came. I was just starting grade school then, but my real education was acquired in the streets. The town population was comprised mainly of Polish immigrants. Workers brought over by the slavers, who were sent to Eastern Europe to recruit men to come to the land where the streets were paved with gold. Again, with the help of the church, the textile companies that hired the workers kept them isolated from the rest of the community. What they soon found out was that instead of gold, the streets were full of men looking for jobs. Much bitterness and hatred was directed at the new arrivals because they signed contracts in the old country to come and work for wages that no one in America could live on. It took the newcomers a long time to understand why they were disliked because of the language barriers and the practical obscurantism of the church. Priests warned them to stay away from the godless Bolshevik agitators. The church, however, could not hide the fact that the new workers were promised barely enough to pay the rent. Many felt like the old country serfs because what the company gave with one hand, they took back with the other. Men who sat on the board of directors of the company also sat on the board of the banks, and they owned apartment buildings and many of the stores. In time, the voices of the union organizers began to penetrate those barriers, and as the disappointment turned to anger, many of the immigrants themselves became union activists, fragmenting the community. Bitter exchanges were heard on streets between friends that came over from the old country together. One faction I can recall was deeply influenced by the anti-Semitic priest, Father Coughlin. His hate-filled diatribe sounded in the homes of those who could afford a radio. If it was an enigmatic time for me, it must have been just as confusing for my friends. We played together and got along fine, except around Easter time when the priest told them that the Jews killed Jesus and that the Jews were responsible for their parents not being able to buy food and clothing. I was bewildered. My mother was a Jew, and we were just as poor as they were. Bessie did not control the banks and Wall Street, as the Coughlinites claimed. Sasha, I would like to point out that this attitude did not change for decades. When I was in high school, I was playing baseball on a Catholic school playground. A young priest came out of the rectory and began to scold one of the boys playing with us. "I never see you at Mass anymore," he said. Then, pointing a finger at the startled young man, he said, "I know you. You would rather go to the movies on Sunday and make the Jew rich." I remember feeling sorry for the red-faced boy. In 1933, I was the youngest member of the family, and I am sure the biggest burden. It was perhaps the worst time in American history to raise children. Whole families of poor people were living in railroad boxcars and hobo makeshift camps. Today, retailers are begging for teenagers to work in their shops. In 1933, there were no jobs that adults wouldn't take. My sister Jerry was already approaching her 20s, and my brother Louis and my sister Ruth were working toward their high school graduation. Dorothy and I were the closest in age, and we were both still in grammar school. How my parents got us through the Depression and kept the whole family together is a question I have often asked myself. I doubt that I could have done it. I never had that kind of communication and understanding with my children. We understood the problems of our parents. We suffered together, and we knew the love and joy of a family with a common goal. I was a bit of a precocious child, often called on to entertain by singing Union songs at meetings that my sisters would take me to. Some of the very popular escapist films made in America at that time featured child actors. The most famous of them was the very talented Shirley Temple. All over America, children were singing songs from her movies like On the Good Ship Lollipop. The son of John Truskoff was singing, sit down, this is a Union town," the anthem of the sit-down strikers in the automotive plants. I loved going to those meetings and demonstrations, but one such event is deeply chiseled into my memory bank. I do not pretend to be a psychologist like Luba, but I assume that there are two ways a child can handle the after effects of such a terrifying experience. One way is to reject it and convince the mind that it never happened. The other would be to see it over and over and over in one's dreams and one's thoughts, so that every detail remains forever. That is how I lived with the trauma resulting from the National Youth Day celebration held on May 30th, 1933, in Perth Amboy, New Jersey. I thought it was going to be so much fun. I got to ride in an open truck wearing a red Tammy hat that my sister had given me, and I joined in with the singing and the laughter of the other young people on the truck. When we arrived at the large open field where the gathering was to be held, early arrivals had already started a baseball game, and others were putting food on large portable tables. Participants brought what they had, and some store owners made donations. I thought that it was going to be a wonderful picnic. After the games and lunch, the entire group of over 400 people marched to the Raritan Copper Works, the scene of recent labor unrest. The copper works was only a short distance away, and the crowd gathered there to hear speeches about working conditions in the plant and the problems facing the working men in America. A quickly assembled speaker stand was erected, and just as the orator began, the motorcycle police arrived. They rode in circles around the group, slipping the clutch and making the machines roar and backfire. Realizing that their purpose was to drive out the voices of the speakers, the crowd began to push back, forcing the police into a wider arc. Some, including my mother, lay on the ground with their arms outstretched. When I saw how close the police bikes were coming to the hands and heads of those lying down, I became frozen in one place. I was too frightened to look for my brothers and sisters. The first screams brought my eyes to the speaker stand, and then to the picture, and then the picture all blends into one mural. Policemen seemed to materialize out of the ground and run towards the stand. Tear gas grenades began to explode, and because it was just 15 years after World War I thought that it was the deadly mustard gas that I had heard about. After all, I was just a child. I could not move. I saw the police pull down the stand, with their clubs coming down on the heads of the running, the terrified. Youth Day celebrants. Suddenly I was snatched up, and the red hat was yanked off my head. I was pushed under a truck, the very same truck that brought me there. My mind and body began to function again, and I started to crawl back out, but fear again held me in its grip as the gunfire sounded just a few yards away. The dust swirled around the feet of the scuffling crowd and mixed with the tear gas, giving the whole spectacle a surrealistic aura. From under the truck, it looked like a play was being acted out above the ground. I saw a black man floating toward the truck, but he didn't quite get there. He fell just as he was bending to get underneath with me. A police club landed on the back of his head and helped him to the ground. The policeman peered under the truck, and someone threw their body over mine, expecting him to throw a gas grenade, but he saw a child and left. After what seemed like hours but was only minutes, there was a ghostly silence. The screaming, the gunfire, and the roar of the motorcycles all stopped. I thought that everyone was dead. Crawling out from under the truck, I had to make my way past the black man, who still was laying on the ground unconscious. The back of his head was red with blood. I was surprised to see so many of the young people, who just a short while ago were singing and playing games, moving like zombies towards the trucks. I was lifted onto one of them, and I could hear the police instructing the driver to get the hell out of town. There was no singing on the way home, and all the red hats had disappeared. Sasha, when I reached my teens and entered high school, I began to look back on that day as the day that I was born. All of my actions appear to emanate from there. I get very emotional when I think about my parents at that time. They were such honest people, trying so hard to raise an American family and risking everything as they tried to make their adopted country a better place in which to live. When I used the word understanding before, I didn't articulate my meaning well. Without saying the words, my parents' actions made us understand that they were trying to make a fair and just world for us. Everything that they did for us. We knew that. We also knew how difficult it was for them to control the constant fear of deportation and or jail. In 1919, when the infamous Palmer raids took place, and the very men who were supposed to be its protectors sullied the Constitution of the United States, democracy was dealt a severe blow. J. Edgar Hoover, the longtime director of the FBI, and Alexander Mitchell Palmer, then the Attorney General of the United States, rounded up the so-called Reds and deported them to the Soviet Union. The purpose was to instill fear into anyone who thought of taking an active role in opposing U.S. government policy. Many new Americans, like my parents, lived daily with the fear of not being able to feed their children. They also carried the fear of being evicted from their homes. They anguished over not being able to give their family the medical attention that they needed, and the extra constant fear of being deported. That fear remained with my father most of his life. It was brought on full bloom again during the Cold War of the 50s and 60s. Oh, my cousin, if our intention is to intellectually, vicariously experience each other's lives, then perhaps I should take the time to immerse you into the churning waters of fear and hate that washed across America in the 30s. We were a divided, fear-filled nation, and the media constantly fanned the flames of citizen antipathies. Headlines told us that the governor of the state of Massachusetts had added armed guards to his entourage to protect him from the communists, who he claimed had threatened to kill him. G. Zangara, who tried to assassinate Franklin Roosevelt, remained a Bolshevik in the minds of the American people, even though there was no evidence to link him to any political philosophy. There were over 1,670 labor strikes here in 1933 alone. According to the New York Times, leftists led most of the strikes. Certainly that is the impression one would get from reading the Times. Strikes became more ugly more often than not, and shootings, beatings, tear gas attacks, and brutal goon violence greeted the strikers. Reds were usually blamed for the labor unrest, relief riots, anti-war protests, and race disturbances. In most of the media reporting, the slant was that if the Red agitators were not present, the violence would subside and the workers would be content. Years later, in the 60s, I heard the same nonsense about Southern black citizens. Racists claimed that if only the Northern Red agitators would leave their blacks alone, it doesn't say blacks, but there would be no race problem at all. Eventually, the media was so overworked their Red agitator stories that most unemployed workers stopped paying attention to them and simply heeded the call of the union organizers. I remember hearing a story about the war that went on in a modern house between the air conditioner that would cool the house and the automatic heater that would heat it. A similar situation went on in the 30s. The more people turned on the propaganda and joined the unions, the more the structure increased the volume. It was like sleet falling on a preheated roof. Americans who were standing in bread lines were too angry to listen to meaningless propaganda. They were willing to follow anyone who could lead them out of the poverty that had turned them into beggars. The shrill media created a hardening of positions, which created more violence, which created a more hysterical press. By 1935, the demoralizing, dehumanizing Great Depression had taken a firm hold on all of America. It was devastating for my father. A big, handsome, intelligent, and very proud man had to stand by and watch helplessly as his wife begged the authorities for food and clothing for her children. Wait, I better correct that. Bessie never begged for anything. She demanded. She also tried to get new Americans who were all bewildered by the locked gates in front of the mills and the broken promises of the recruiters to identify the enemy. One bright spring night, One bright spring day, I believe that it was in May of 1935, I came home from school to find a group of women all standing in front of our apartment house and chattering about the Jew lady. When I went into the building, I could hear them shouting in Polish, "Come on, come on, follow the Jew lady." Of course, I knew who the Jew lady was, because I was the Jew boy. I ran into our apartment, but my mother was not there. I quickly ran back down the stairs and out onto the sidewalk. There I found my mother, ready to lead a procession away from the house. The 25-pound bag of relief flour she carried weighted down her 5-foot 2-inch frame. I can still see that bag. I remember it well because I hated the sight of it. It had a big red cross on it and the words "relief" in big black letters written across it for all to see. I knew that most of the people in town were on relief, now called welfare, but I liked to pretend that we were not. That day, my mother staggered a mile with that bag on her shoulder. A long line of women on the sidewalk followed her. They were not smiling. They were not singing songs. They too had families to feed, and they meant business. A few days earlier, my mother told a newspaper reporter what relief flour really was. The so-called commodities for the poor were nothing more than old spoiled storage food that could not be sold anyway. The flour is full of worms, she said. A bureaucrat at City Hall, who was in charge of the relief program, made the mistake of calling Bessie a liar. Obviously, he had never opened a bag, and it was in his office that my mother and all the women were headed for. Before the police could stop her, Bessie burst into his office. She pulled the string that opened the bag and spread wormy flour all over his desk, his office floor, and his blue bureaucratic suit. "See!" she screamed. "See the damn worms!" The other women joined in the shouting. Some screamed in Polish, others in English, some in Yiddish. They blocked the door, trying to prevent the police from coming in to arrest my mother. I remember how small she looked when the two policemen, each holding her by the arm, dragged her away, her little feet not touching the floor. I was a bit confused the next day when the paper said that Bella Reed was arrested. My sister explained that it was a name that my mother used to protect my father from being deported. She took the name from John Reed, whom she admired. The next day in court, Bessie stood alongside the 6-foot, 2-inch policeman who arrested her. He charged my mother with not only disturbing the peace, but also attacking a police officer. The judge peered down at Bessie, who was half the officer's size. "She attacked you?" he asked. "Do you want to see the scars where she kicked me?" the burly man replied, bringing a chorus of laughter from the women in the room. The judge dismissed the case. My wife asked me once how I can remember things that happened when I was so young. My answer was simple. How could I forget? They were the foundation of my being. That particular event with the flower was very important because it bridged a deep chasm that divided the new Americans. The lack of trust and communication among the various ethnic groups was a major stumbling block for union organizers in the 30s. When things became so bad that they were forced to stand together for their very survival, they began to bring about the change that would recreate America. Some workers then were truly as bad off as the Russian serfs were. In many coal mining towns and textile towns, the people were virtually owned by the company. As I said before, the same people who also owned the mines and the factories owned all the stores. They owned the houses that the workers lived in and the utility companies. The paycheck was always just enough to pay the rent and buy a little food. There were no welfare agencies then, no safety net for the poor, no 8-hour working day with overtime pay for extra hours, no Social Security, no vacation with pay, no coffee breaks, no unemployment insurance, no paid medical benefits, no union grievance committees, and very little peace of mind. All of the things that Americans take for granted now were just a radical's dream then. The members of the International Workers of the World were singing Ralph Chaplin's song, "For we have a glowing dream of how fair the world will seem when each man can live his life secure and free." I often ask young students and try to imagine living in that America and to think of all the sacrifices that the greenhorns had to make to give their parents and them the working conditions that they now enjoy. I like to tell them that the people who are handing them all those wonderful benefits are those immigrants from all over the world who came together in the 30s and fought the labor wars. They bled and died in the streets so that their children and their children's children could live their dream. To assume that the labor war history is irrelevant in this high-tech society is stupid and tragic. It was the victories won by the labor warriors of the 30s that enabled the parents of today's young executives to send them to college. With the rise of Hitler in Germany and the Herculean efforts of Franklin D. Roosevelt to pacify the workers and save the capitalist system, the energies of my parents were pointed in another direction. At my age, I can transcend the history and feel what I am certain my parents must have felt at that time. As the decades of the 30s drew to a close, they must have been weary of the political battles and of the labor wars. I am sure that my father just wanted to work and get some pleasure out of the rest of his life. My mother had her hands full with 5 children. Almost all had reached that mystical world of the untouchables called the teenage years. They did not need another battle, but the battle came to them. Anti-Semitism and fascism could not be ignored. Roosevelt restored confidence in America. He made the many first-generation Americans believe the promise of real democracy can be realized if they will work with him and support him, and they did. My parents felt the tension ease with the inauguration of FDR. He recognized the Soviet Union, attacked the monopolies, especially the oppressive utility holding companies, and made an honest attempt to put people back to work. I should hasten to add that it wasn't until his second term that the nation felt the healing and became whole again. It is a sad fact that there was little time for Bessie and John to enjoy the new atmosphere. The time that they had for healing was not nearly long enough for a cure. Hitler lifted the carpet, and the anti-Semites crawled out. The Detroit radio priest, Father Coughlin, stepped up his attacks on the administration. At first, my parents were a bit annoyed by FDR accepting the support of such a man, but they knew that, above all, FDR was a politician. To no one's surprise, the relationship between FDR and the priest soon became antagonistic. Eleanor Roosevelt later revealed that her husband disliked and distrusted Coughlin from the very beginning. In his radio harangues, the priest began to refer to the president as that Franklin double-crossing Roosevelt. All during the terrible years that followed the Wall Street crash, an attempt was made to cover up the real cause and to direct attention away from the culprits who brought it about and to point a finger at a much more defenseless target. It was easy to channel some of the rage towards the Jews. Perhaps the students of philosophy could put the virulent racism and anti-Semitism into some sort of historical perspective. Maybe it was a need that germinated before humans left the caves. It might be that a psychoanalyst could explain America as a mental breakdown of the 30s. But to a boy not yet in his teens, it was just a continuation of one long nightmare. A nightmare that so many second-generation children of poor parents had to live through. I was a Jew because I was my mother's son, and my mother told me that I was a Jew. No one ever bothered to explain to me what a Jew was, and I doubt that if Bessie were alive today, she could explain it any better than her first attempt, which was simply that my grandmother was a Jew. My mother was a Jew. Therefore, I am a Jew. My father's family remained in the Soviet Union, and I had no relationships with them at all. My mother's family was here, and while my grandmother often referred to the rabbis as Gonevs, my grandfather and all his daughters called themselves Jews. Our family never attended any religious services at all. My grandfather did on special occasions. He even gave a large grant to the building committee for a new temple, and my grandmother never forgave him for it. When he died, Rachel chased the rabbis, who came to call, out of the house. She refused to have any religious service at all. After much haggling, she finally consented to a compromise. The family rode in cars to the cemetery, and those that had the religious service on the porch walked. When Rachel died, she left a will asking to be cremated. Relatives and others from my grandfather's temple came to the funeral home and tore off their clothes in protest. My father always told me not to worry about religion. When you are older, you will understand, he would say. Today I am much older, and I still do not understand religion. After returning from a trip to Israel in 1970, I wrote a piece that I thought was very humorous. I titled it, "What is a Jew?" I had witnessed the most ludicrous debate in Israel. A man who was not a Jew, but had been responsible for saving many Jews from the Nazis, brought his family to live in Israel. He was denied citizenship because he was not a Jew. The article that I wrote pointed out the irony of the question of what is a Jew, and how is it being debated. My agent at the time was Ad Schilberg, who did not think it was very funny. She canceled our agreement and sent all of my work back to me. Zionism could not be joked about or criticized. Anyone who did so was branded as divisive. It was the worst thing that you could say about a Jew then. Recently, I wrote a piece for the paper in which I stated that blind faith will do for the Israeli people what it did for the German people. After a series of trips to Israel and an attempt to bring some rational thought for my family and I about Zionism, I finally came to the conclusion that I am of Russian Yiddish parentage. I can easily define the difference between Yiddish and Jewish, and I can even more easily separate myself from right-wing fanatical Zionism. I am anxious to know how you handled the question of your parentage, Sasha. I am also surprised that I have written so many pages. It's a bit embarrassing to learn that I can talk about myself so easily. As you see, the early years of my life were most difficult, and I was actually relieved to escape into the United States Navy. I would like to tell you more about my joining the Navy in our next letter, because it was more than just the ending of one life and the starting of another. It was the beginning of a new relationship with my parents. As the 40s began and the decade of the 30s ended, America was also starting a new life. Huge population moves from the rural areas into the cities not only brought about demographic changes, but political changes as well. The Navy, however, was frozen in time. The United States Navy pretended that the king still ruled all the colonies. Sasha, I wonder if you feel the same growing excitement over the potential of the two of us collaborating on a book. Do you think that the enclosed material will give you something to work with? Is it too personal? Perhaps we should get an objective opinion before we plunge ahead. With love from all of the Truskoffs here to all of the family there, I close, sincerely, your cousin David Truskoff. And that's it. Thank you.